I am the pure breath of God. Good morning, YouTube. It's me again. I think it's story time. Story time. I grew up in Alberta, and my parents lived near a small town called Sylvan Lake. And they met each other. I don't suppose there was a whole lot of people to choose from, so they met each other and they decided to get married and have a family. So they did that. They got married and they started having children. They had a daughter, my sister, and then they had a son. And then they had me in a real hurry. In less than 3 years, they had 3 children under the age of 3. So that's a lot of work. For those of you who have children, you realize that having 3 at a time spread out so close together is a lot of work and can be very, very stressful. And then on top of that, this is the kicker, my dad drank alcohol. And sometimes when he drank alcohol, he blacked out. And I don't know if any of you have blacked out before or experienced it, but it's a very, very strange sensation because it's possible to lose consciousness, and yet it isn't even all that easy to tell if someone's blacked out. Sometimes they act differently than they normally would, but not always. And other times they're just a little funnier or a little quieter or a little something, but they just seem like themselves. So my dad drank alcohol, and it's kind of a strange thing. Alcohol is kind of like an allergy for some people, and when they drink it, can you imagine something that consuming it makes you lose consciousness? Like if it were anything other than alcohol, it would be illegal, it would be a horrible, horrendous thing, but totally normal if you're into booze to black out. And it seems kind of funny. People have all sorts of stories about it. It wasn't funny in our household. I wasn't, they only wanted to have 2 kids. They didn't want to have 3. But of course, one of those days when my dad decided to have a few too many drinks at work or something like that, he blacked out, he came home, and he decided that it was time that my mother had sex with him, even though she'd had a child not more than a couple of months before. And bingo, lo and behold, I'm on my way. So that was pretty stressful. My mother did not want to be pregnant. She did not want to have another child. And throughout the whole entire pregnancy, she was beside herself and extremely unhappy. And I don't know, I have a child, and I think if mama is emotionally devastated and overwhelmed, that a child can feel that. A child can feel that extremely a lot. Whatever I'm trying to say, I don't know. Anyway, boom. My mother was also morbidly obese. And so morbidly obese women sometimes get some kind of diabetes. I don't know what it's called, but it's a kind of diabetes that pregnant people get. And it is common in heavy women who are having a child. So my mother had that. I have all of the symptoms of a child that was born to a mother with infant onset diabetes or whatever the hell it's called. I was late. I was nearly a month late. I was a very big baby, and I have a subcutaneous layer of fat that is very common amongst people who whose parents had this kind of diabetes. And so, anyway, what I'm saying is not only was my mother unhappy to be in the situation she was in, she also was dealing with chemical imbalances in her body and blood sugar issues and diabetes kind of things, which is pretty heavy duty, right? So finally, after 10 months of gestation, I show up on the doorstep, and at this point, my mother really is overwhelmed, and she pretty much immediately went into what I guess some people would call a postpartum depression, and it was a severe postpartum depression. And my dad was not really very good at being her husband, and he was not all that supportive. And he also worked out of town in, different locations and whatever to try and support his budding young family. And so she was alone with the three of us a lot. And for the first couple of years of my life, she was in a pretty severe postpartum depression, and she was barely able to look after herself, let alone the three of us. And she did. She went through the motions. She fed us, and she made sure that we were safe and alive, but it was a stress on her. And at one point I was talking to my mother about something, and she looked at me and she said, well, the first couple of years of your life, you just sat there. You ate and slept for 2 years and barely made a peep. And I'm thinking, really? Like, how weird is that? Like, Lucas was certainly not like that. My son, he was an active, thriving member of the crew right from the moment he arrived. He had stuff to say and he had things to do, and he certainly didn't sit there quietly for 2 years. So I thought, wow, how weird is that? And, in hindsight, my mother's emotional state was so tenuous that it was pointless trying to ask for something or trying to interact with her. I just basically sat there and waited for the first at least 2 years, if not more, like 3 or 4. I remember my mother she just wasn't very well. And then eventually she became a school teacher. And so I was 6 or something, and she decided that she couldn't go to work until I was at least in grade 1. So she started being a school teacher at that point, and she was much better after she was a school teacher. I think that she was happier with a career and happier with some income of her own and some feeling of control in her life, and she came out of her depression at that point. But the first several years of my life were sitting there quietly waiting for somebody to wake up and interact with me in a way that I can relate to. And, it sounds kind of like a sad, sad story. It isn't really. I mean, my mother loved me, and my father loved me, and my brother and sister loved me. And yet, because of the situation, I just sat there and I learned how to observe life. I learned how to sit quietly and watch what was going on around me, and how to listen carefully to everything that was happening in my environment, and to just enjoy that. And, it serves me very well now. I'm an extremely good observer. I have absolutely no trouble at all being alone. I enjoy my own company in a way that's really kind of bizarre. And right now with this whole lockdown thing, it's great. I am totally at peace with this. I could lock down forever. In some ways, it feels like I've wanted this my whole life. It's like life backed off, and I'm on my own, and I'm happy, and I'm comfortable in my beautiful home, and I have all of the money I need, and it's kind of like a wonderful thing. And I learned how to do this when I was a tiny little baby, sitting there waiting for my mother to get healthy enough to interact with me. And So, it sounds like a big tragedy. My mother had postpartum depression. Oh, my dear, it's so terrible. But there's a lot of upsides to stuff like that. There's a lot of upsides to stuff like that. Then, shortly after, and I don't know, within a couple of 3 months, I suppose, my dad continued to drink the first few years of their marriage. And at one point, he once again blacked out, and he had, when he was blacked out, he abused us sexually. And at one point, my mother caught him. And it was such a weird vibe. She never, ever, ever forgave him. She never, ever, ever, if she would have just divorced him and moved on or something, but nobody got divorced back then, it would have been so great. But instead of that, she laid down the law. And it was like, you are never going to drink in our house again. And you are never, ever, ever going to have alcohol in this house. And if you do, some terrible thing is going to happen and whatever. And, the tension in our house. My dad was what I would call a dry drunk. He was an alcoholic that didn't have the benefits of a 12-step program or anything. He just dry drunked it and suffered all the way through. And so every once in a while, I don't know, like once a year or something like that, he'd go to the staff Christmas party at work or something like that, and he would come home and he would be once again blacked out, and all hell would break loose in our house. There'd be like, I don't know, verbal abuse and anger and hollering and screaming, and all of us were sitting there at the kitchen table having dinner, and dad is like turned into a raging maniac, and all these years of anger bubbling up in front of our eyes, and it was like we were terrified. And then back to being a dry drunk, and it was just such a weird vibe. Our house was so tense and so filled with angst that you could cut it like a knife, and all of us were just sitting there waiting for the next time that something like that was going to happen. And it was a really weird vibe. And so anyway, I just want to tell the story and put it out there and then file it away and never tell it again. It's like, my parents were good people. They were kind and sweet, and they tried the best they could, and the best they could sometimes wasn't that great, but Lord knows I've been there. A lot of times I've tried and not been able to function very well. And so it's kind of like, I just want to tell the story and then let it go. So that's what I'm doing. I'm telling the story and I'm going to let it go. And at the same time, I'm going to pour oceans and oceans and oceans of ascended master sacred fire power love to every one of you sweet lovely people in the world of YouTube. Thank you very much for tuning in. Press that subscription button. Oh, I have tons more stories. That's just the beginning. There'll be more mental hospital stories. There'll be more, and it's just like, definitely subscribe. You are not going to want to miss this. See you. Bye.